Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of an audio podcast around on the fourth series on around the scientist, and this series being about the LabZtorm impact, and this audio podcast is about the science of Labostix and research and online modalities. This is another Storm Labostix production, and today I'm going to give an overview on how research in healthcare, from a healthcare perspective, has been sort of advancing in several around several focuses, but also that how the way researchers and investigators look to collect data, so almost a highlight really between traditional ways of collecting data collection versus the more novel ways of collecting data, depending on sort of research questions as well. So I'm going to break this this audio podcast into a few sections. There'll be an introduction, a brief introduction, some aspects about what literature says. So in this context, a bit of understanding around design and methodology, and then there will be a focus on sort of findings around this particular topic, highlighting a few themes that have been identified in literature, and then there will be sort of a brief summary with some conclusions, and then I will highlight a few resources for listeners to go check out in their own time. So to build up an understanding in your own time, so to speak. So to begin with, I'm going to highlight a bit of an introduction around this topic. So research using the internet or sort of online modalities has actually offered opportunity and provided opportunity for researchers and investigators to sort of build an understanding around gaps, and bridge those gaps to help answer questions and research questions in various ways. And the internet and online and sort of doing things through the internet or online or digitally even has offered unparalleled opportunities for researchers, investigators, and actually participants who might be interested or intrigued to get involved in aspects of research to access sort of access routes to getting involved, etc. And that means that also has, in line with that, has offered sort of unparalleled opportunities than researchers and investigators who might have looked to collect understanding and around specific research questions traditionally, so access is not limited by and through online and doing things through online and the internet. It means that access is not as limited as it once was by for example constraints of time and geography. So for example, where investigators and researchers trying to look to understand certain areas of healthcare to and ask sort of poignant questions, they to potential researchers, for example, ask specific questions to participants who might want to get involved in research. Doing things through online does not necessarily mean now and anymore really that investigators go to where the participants are and their locales or their sort of regions, etc. It's more about how sort of the online doing things online has sort of bridged that sort of in one way issue, but also in another way has kind of can and has caused researchers some hindrances as well. So it's about even with where there are those opportunities, it doesn't mean to say that outrightly that they are always positive. So works by Eisenbach and Till in 2001 sort of retrospectively highlights some aspects around that. Now, where this is concerned, and when we're talking about data collection in this context, obviously you can data can be collected from a quantitative perspective or qualitative perspective, but in this context I'm going to focus more on the qualitative side of things. So qualitative work sort of aims to convert visual and or narrative data into sort of a way to contextualize to help answer what, why, and also how, but not how many or how frequently. And in this context, is characterized by its own distinctive vocabulary as well. So qualitative versus quantitative investigations actually have sort of different or different sort of in a way philosophical underpinnings as well. There was a previous audio in one of the in a series in one of the scientist series previously that highlighted a little bit more around the philosophical approaches, and I'm not going to do a repeat around that here, but suffice to say that there are differences between or schools of thought as to how data can be collected using these different philosophical approaches. So it's characterized by its own distinctive vocabulary, and works by Babur in 1999 sort of highlight some context around that. And that means that the way investigators and researchers interact and sort of become on the one hand lead aspects of research, but also become participants or participatory active participants, or in aspects of research, to actually ensure that they can get the appropriate understanding from from those who they are involving in their research, can help sort of having these sort of approaches can help reach interplays and reach across different disciplines, including anthropology and psychology, and sort of healthcare sciences, aspects of medicine, areas around medicine or medicine specialty, medical specialties, and so on and so forth. The qualitative data collection model just in the main aims to complement quantitative in some way, and it does work in the other way in parallel as well, where studies by are formed by producing records of semi-structured dialogue, or sort of interview conversations, and observational research, or even film capture, documentary, enquiry, or to sort of survey around a particular focus, or where there are where there can be either misinformation or inambiguity. So again, Babur has authored quite a lot around this area and around this focus, and there's a paper that he published that's been published by Babur in 1999 and in 2000 around this. Data collection has also become increasingly important to different allied health professionals, and however, the emphasis around this is still sort of and it should be underscored really, that evidence-based medicine is pretty much at the forefront of most health professionals when it comes to practicing aspects of their implementing their skill set, I should say. And then what happens is that emphasis will then into place where in contextualizing the data that's been collected through different excuse me, through different participants who have been who are involved, and then together with the recognition of the importance of an area that needs to be a focus that needs to be sort of explored. There are there are allied health professionals across different disciplines that can actually acknowledge should be able to acknowledge the sort of the benefits or the advantages of implementing qualitative methodology. And there's an author who's done quite a lot around evidence-based practice, or evidence-based kind of highlights the importance of definitions, earlier definitions of evidence-based medicine, for example, and that comes from an author called Sackett, and his team, and the team in from dating back to 1996. So just after the kind of conception of when the internet actually came into effect. The internet, as you will know, listeners, hopefully, that the internet actually kind of came into effect from 1995 onwards. With the context that and the works that came out from Sackett in 1996, there was a real sort of push to provide a new dimension of implementing data collection along with evidence-based practices relating to experiences, attitudes and beliefs in certain sort of areas of health practices and so on and so forth, to inform and develop a better healthcare strategies. So Sackett and team comment on or highlight a bit more around that, as does Huston and Rowan in 1998. Evidence-based context around evidence-based medicine, apart from what Sackett has highlighted and team highlight in 1996, and in line with that, clinical trials or implementation of clinical trials in and around different aspects around healthcare are to be sort of understood in this context, because wherever evidence-based, or that terminology evidence-based comes into effect, or in literature where it's been related, is more around focuses around sort of medical practice or clinical medicine, and ultimately in areas of where investigators or trialists are involved in developing clinical trials to potentially understand whether specific areas of healthcare can be improved by recruiting patients or individuals and participants into particular healthcare practices or trials or clinical trials, so that they can that there can be advantages around that, advantages to ultimately bring about better and smarter healthcare. Now, works by notwithstanding what's been highlighted in literature already, I'm just going to highlight a little bit around where typically how searching doing like a sort of an inquest or inquiry from a sort of from a sort of healthcare perspective, and how researchers and investigators would potentially use several search engines or databases to actually sift out or filter out different to identify and filter out the appropriate literature according to areas of inquiry that they're looking to sort of approach. And so, for example, doing searches around particular research questions can take obviously it does take time and practice, but researchers who look to identify gaps in healthcare, or bridge gaps in healthcare, for example, may use several search engines or databases, and they might include PubMed or PubMed Central, Medline databases, and EBSCO under another search engine called EBSCO search engine or host engine, and which normally is the umbrella for the sort of additional search engines or sort of databases, that link to those areas of healthcare that relate to sort of behavioral sciences, psychology, and sort of areas of nursing practice, and areas of sort of pretty much focus more on research that is actually more qualitative than quantitative, versus PubMed or PubMed Central and Medline databases. They are those particular databases focus more on clinical medicine or medical practices that align to sort of more open quote, close quote, hard sort of medical practices, and typically several it's sort of main terminologies can be implemented to identify and filter out particular literature around sort of a topic that is being approached, and in this context, there's also a so once papers or papers that relate to a particular research question, for example, have been identified, investigators or researchers might then want to sort of ensure that the literature that's been identified is directly applicable and appropriate to what they're looking to investigate, and so therefore along with identifying literature, for example, an appraisal's toolkit should also be sort of attached to that, so that that researchers can actually then sort of score off and ensure that that the literature that they've sort of filtered out through their searching through searching their particular databases between, for example, again, PubMed Central, and Medline databases, and then using EBSCO host engine, which again highlights has additional databases that relate to papers around psychology and nursing type practices, etc. That they can use by applying implementing a critical skills appraisal or an appraisal skills program that can actually help score of how relevant or significant particular papers are that have come out from basic searching, basic or applying sort of additional parameters around searching, additional parameters around particular literature searching, so that the papers that result from those literature searching, literature searching, they can actually, they're directly appropriate and applicable, and so typically in a critical using a critical appraisal skills program, there'll be several questions within an appraisal skills a toolkit whereby researchers can mark off whether according to the particular questions that the papers that have been identified through the literature search can then sort of narrow down more specifically and even more so to the paper, the literature that is directly relevant, but also to say that that would implementing a sort of an appraisal skills program can then also bring down a search that might from the outset might churn out for example 800 or 900 papers, and then by applying a critical skills program and using that sort of toolkit and to appraise the papers that are appropriate, it might go from 800 or 900 papers or that investigators might have thought that are appropriate, down to something like 100 or 50 or less than that. And then that way it should also the idea of using an appraisal skills program is also to actually reduce to offset any potential research bias when looking for identifying papers as well. So in some works that the team from the renal patient support group have published, there's some intriguing research from that, and some of the papers that have come out and the works that have come out, there has been publications that have applied the critical skills appraisal program in one way or another, and things like, for example, understanding how using different data, data collection sort of modalities and media to help answer a research question that team have highlighted that's quite high on should be quite high on any sort of researchers or research or investigators list. Maximizing responses to complete to help complete and sort of find answers to particular questions. Obviously, that's also quite high, and shouldn't be no surprise there, because every investigator or researcher will want to have answers to particular questions. And then the advantages and disadvantages of using the internet to collect data. That's also quite important. Ethics and the ethics and the approach and around confidentiality, privacy, and and ensuring really that research abides by sort of the data collection, data protection sort of guidelines that date back to 1998, or the update on the Data Protection Act, for example, from 1998 would be the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation from 2018. Those that is should be important on anyone who's doing sort of looking to collect data online as well. So that's high on that's another thing, another focus to consider, where researchers need to sort of, especially doing qualitative data collection, should consider. And then generally the sort of advantages and disadvantages and sort of limitations to collecting data through our online modalities is also quite important. And whilst the focus, this podcast is sort of focusing or elaborating on the qualitative side, quantitative research is just as can be just as complex in some way, because of trying to maximize responses through for example, implementing a link or a survey link, a link to a survey, for example. Sometimes is just not enough. Researchers themselves have to sort of interact with participants to ensure that they can somehow maximize responses in some way or another, but also without compromising the data, potential data collection, and compromising aspects of sort of implementing and compromising integrity where there can be research bias. In some research, though, findings have indicated that internet research expedites outcomes when compared to conventional methods, and there's a paper by Ahern in 2005 that sort of highlights some context around that, and it's also it's been sort of nubbed in some ways, but deemed sort of practical alternative for sort of implementing research interviews, validating certain aspects of research, and some research questions and some themes of research work better if they're implemented, if there's a focus around collecting data online versus versus the conventional way. And especially open quote, close quote, for example, those hard to reach populations. And when researchers normally refer to hard to reach populations, it's those who might have, for example, learning disabilities or are disadvantaged, and there may be, poverty or impoverishment in some way, and that can be can be problematic when trying to study and understand certain populations, and obviously in those areas, or where and also where participants where there can be language barriers, for example. So in works in relating rapid interaction with potential with participants has been possible, and it's still quite progressive, with relating to I'll use there's the example again, the renal patient support group, where there is at any one time, for example, at least from the works that I've identified and looked through, that at any one time, for example, on the RPSG sort of closed Facebook group, for example, there can be any number of participants ranging from from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, but there can be on average out of at present, where there's a good sort of broad sort of membership of participants or potential participants, but also obviously service users using the platform. At any one time, there's a good number who are looking to share experiences, etc., around particular questions and conundrums. And so that can, if and looking at the example from some of the publications that have come out by the renal patient support group, there's a lot of sort of ethica and focus around the ethics, privacy and confidentiality, to ensure that patient so that there is no compromise around patient identifiable information. So that's to be appreciated, and it should be understood. So that being said, online implementing sort of qualitative research online can actually help and provide sort of opportunities, and offers opportunities to possible data collection, from more globally or more worldwide, and collection of high quality data is limited. It can be limited only by really the skill set of the respondent, and also the actual research investigator themselves, and the quality of software that might be available, and research. That there has been quite a lot of focus, more literature has been published around that now, but there is a paper by Kelly and Oldham in 1997 that sort of highlight how that can cause impingement in some way. So there is also, in addition to that, there's benefits to internet-based studies, which include the reducing of sort of costs of data generation or data collection, where for example investigators and even participants, where they would normally sort of agree to be at a particular location, etc., to ensure data collection can be pursued, but online and doing things online can be beneficial, at least in the sense where people, the researchers and participants, might not or do not have to go as far. For example, in addition to the to that, though, there is a rapid recruit. There can be more positive experiences around recruitment of participants and sort of heterogeneous cohorts of participants in particular around special categories. For example, as individuals with particular conditions, for example. So there has been some focus and publications around that, included one by Duffy in 2002, and some focus around that from Birnbaum in 2004. So that also helps facilitate the analysis as well in some way or another by researchers. The variety of web-based media platforms also can allow greater scope for the collection of qualitative data in regard to various research disciplines. Eisenbach and Till in 2001 highlight quite a bit around that, and Eisenbach and Wyatt in 2002. The privacy of that internet, in one way that the internet and online online modalities allow can improve data by reducing response bias as well. And Cantrell and Lupinacci in 2007 highlight some context around that. Confidentiality is believed to sort of confidentiality in related to data collection generally should prompt assurance to participants, enabling them to reply to sensitive sort of questions more openly, and reducing reply partiality as well, and investigator inclined preferences, thus improving the truthfulness and the validity of factual content of sort of the dialogue and exchanges that happen between research and participant. And Cantrell and Lupacini in 2007 again highlight a bit about that, and there have been more recent paper publications around this particular topic and focus. And this applies also to quantitative questions and sort of metric analysis, and investigations, studies and investigations that are focused on sort of evaluation, and sort of gathering that sort of data collection around sort of epidemiological studies and areas in where there is an alignment to statistical sort of hard statistics as well. So Strickland and team in 2003 highlight quite a bit around that, and Griggs in 2011 emphasize a bit more on that as well. So in summary, I want to highlight that internet-based studies deliver an array of benefits such as contact to explicit, occasionally challenging populations, swiftness of communication, and can help reduce costs for information production. Web-based research has been found to be practical for interviewing, validating measures, and sort of aspects around qualitative research, but notwithstanding also quantitative sort of research and studying sort of, again, the sensitive and hard to reach populations. Further comparisons of data collected, however, and using traditional face-to-face and online modalities are still whilst there have been quite a lot of papers, authors have kind of highlighted around that context quite proactively, especially the works by author Birnbaum and Babur have highlighted quite a lot around that. But that being said, there is still when it comes to aspects of health research, and where disparity and equality may still be a premise that can be relatable to focuses around health literacy and health language, etc., and so on and so forth. So more research does need to sort of focus, should be around that, at least from what works are out already, and saying and there's a sort of a unison understanding from authors saying that is sort of what's been required or needed, and especially around particular healthcare aspects around healthcare to help answer specific healthcare questions. So in conclusion, with respect to or with regard to collecting sort of data collection sort of more generally, it's kind of entered a new era, but more so since past the new obviously since 2000 and being the new millennium around then, more so in the last decade from 2000 and just before 2010, 2009, around that era, there was a lot more focus or sort of encouragement to use online sort of communications and to help collect or sort of supplement, if not outrightly implemented as part of research methodologies, then in one way to supplement or be additional to to some of those traditional forms of data some of those traditional ways of data collection, i.e. through online communications, such as Skype, for example, or and now more recently, more so, modalities such as MS Teams and Zoom, for example, but also even WebEx and go to meeting, etc. These are all kind of viable avenues that researchers can explore, and freely available software and a range of IT applications permit new opportunities and greater flexibility in the development of research investigations. However, data comparison continues to require a blend of both, actually, and that's also been highlighted by several authors, basically having that blend of traditional face-to-face and online can be advantageous. Online data collection for health research includes potential benefits of increased participation of subjects in sort of in at least one way or another, in participants from sort of those hard to reach populations or groups in one way or another, and investigating sort of those research questions that are very that can be challenging in a face-to-face sort of setting. So gathering and gathering data from sort of those populations that are broadly dispersed. For example, people with low sort of incident conditions or learning disabilities, or where there is there can be disability that can make research participation challenging for those in those particular cohorts. However, it is vital that researchers using online data collection adhere to strict ethical principles, and that's pivotal and to help develop, and it's important to help develop new sort of guidelines and around areas around that practice, so that there is apart from the novelty, there is also rigor and care is taken to ensure that participants and researchers are not going to be compromised, and there is a literature out there to highlight examples of best practice around that. So that's all I'm going to say, listeners, in this particular audio and podcast. I am going to highlight a few resources for further reading if you want to check these out, and you're more than welcome to do so. So to begin with, there's a paper publication by Ahern in 2005, and using the internet to conduct research, and this is a paper publication in Nurse Research, and it's quite a good one. Atkinson and team in 2007 look at assessment of sort of nutrition and physical activity education needs of low-income rural mothers, and look at can technology can technology play a role in that? That was published in a Journal of Community Health. Babel's paper in 1999, the case for combining qualitative and quantitative approaches in health services research, that's been published in the Journal of Health Services Research and Policy. It's quite a good one just to get an understanding of a little bit about mixed methodology, but also around those methodologies in context to health service research. The paper by Birnbaum in 2004, Human Research and Data Collection via the Internet, Annual Review of Clinical Psychology. It's quite a good paper to check out. There's the paper by Cantrell and Lupacini in 2007, methodological issues in online data collection, and that was published in Journal of Advanced Nursing. There's a paper by Duffy in 2002, methodological issues in web-based research, that was published in Journal of Nursing Scholarship. There's a paper by Eisenbach and Till in 2001, ethical issues in qualitative research on internet communities British. That was published in the British Medical Journal. A paper by Eisenbach and Wyatt in 2002, using internet for surveys and health research. That was published in Journal of Medical Internet Research as well. Not as well. It's a different journal to the other paper by Eisenbach and Till in 2001. The paper by Griggs in 2011, ethnographic study of alternative sports by alternative means, list mining as a method of data collection. That was published in a Journal of Empirical Research on human research ethics. There's a paper by Huston and Rowan in 1998. Quite dated, but it's quite a good one. Qualitative studies and their role in medical research, and it was published in a Canadian Family Physician, Medicine de Famille, a Canadian, and that's basically a French Canadian journal. Kelly and Oldham in 1997, the Internet and Randomized Controlled Trials, Internet Journal of Medical Informatics, and that's quite a good one as well. And then finally, there is the I would recommend checking this out as well. It's how to conduct an effective and valid literature search, and along with that, there's normally a kind of a link to the critical appraisal skills program, and if listeners get an opportunity to check that out, then actually what happens is that with the critical skills appraisal program, there's normally a downloadable 1 or 2 pages which actually basically help researchers and investigators to ensure that they are doing what they can to ensure that whatever they're looking to investigate with, and whatever research question that they're looking to find answers to, that they can actually apply research. They can actually apply the critical skills appraisal program to ensure that they really are getting the appropriate literature based on that particular research question. and I will highlight this. This is the final the final. This will be the last paper here. It's run by Strickland and team in 2003, and its measurement issues related to data collection on the World Wide Web, and this was in a nursing sciences journal. Again, though some of these, or most of these, are quite are pretty are over, are quite dated. They have a good basis on how to get an understanding on particular things that have been discussed in this audio and podcast. So that's it, listeners. This has been The Scientist, and this has been audio podcast in the series around the LabZtorm impact, and this series 4, and this has been an audio podcast around the science, Labostix, research and online modalities, and it's been another Storm Labostix production. Thanks for listening. Take care now. And I hope you enjoyed it.